The Shimokita Peninsula sits at the northernmost edge of Honshu, where the land narrows into a crooked finger pointing toward Hokkaido. In October, the last of the deciduous oaks drop their leaves in a single week, and the forest floor becomes a map of rust and gold that no one reads. By November, the first snow arrives without announcement. By December, it has buried everything below the knee. It stays until March. This is the northernmost habitat of the Japanese macaque, the only non-human primate on Earth that regularly lives in a climate like this. Not because this place is easy, because they learned it. The troop on this part of the peninsula numbers 23 individuals. There are 3 adult males, 9 adult females, 4 juveniles, and 7 younger animals, whose ranks shift depending on the season and who is watching. The ranger responsible for monitoring this troop is in his 2nd year at the Shimokita Wildlife Research Station. He is 26 years old. He carries a field notebook with a cracked spine and a pencil worn down to 2 inches, and he sharpens it with a small folding knife he keeps in his left breast pocket. Every morning before entering the forest, he sharpens the pencil once, 2 strokes each side, then closes the knife and puts it back. He does this whether or not he expects to write anything. His supervisor told him in his first week that consistency is the only language a wild animal will eventually trust. He has not forgotten it. Among the 23 members of the troop, there is one female who stands apart from the others, not by size, not by rank, but by distance. She positions herself at the outer edge of the group in almost every situation. When the troop moves between foraging sites, she follows at the back. When the group settles near the thermal springs on the eastern ridge for warmth, she sits 10 meters away on a snow-covered route facing the same direction as the others, but touching none of them. She is approximately 5 years old young for a breeding female, but not unusually so. She has never allowed the ranger to come within 10 meters of her. Not once in the months he has been monitoring this troop. Every time he crossed the invisible boundary, she maintained she retreated, not in panic, not with alarm calls, but quietly with deliberate steps, as if she simply preferred a different part of the forest. He stopped trying. Instead, he began recording her behavior from the distance she permitted. He noted which direction she faced when resting. He noted what she ate and in what order. He noted the specific rock she preferred to sit on, a flat granite shelf near the base of a white birch. And he gave the rock a number in his notebook, the way researchers give numbers to things they cannot yet name. He did not name her. He did not need to. She was the one at the edge. That was enough to find her every day. In early October, the ranger began to notice something that did not appear in the standard field notes he submitted to the station. She was gaining weight, not dramatically. Not the kind of weight gain that announces itself, but the kind that accumulates slowly, in the rounding of the abdomen, in the way she held herself when sitting in the slightly wider stance she took when descending a slope. He noted it in his personal notebook, not the official one. He wrote female at Rock 7, possible pregnancy confirmed in 3 weeks. 3 weeks later, he confirmed it. Japanese macaque females carry their young for approximately 170 days, roughly 5.5 months. The timing of conception and the timing of birth matters enormously in a place where winter is not a metaphor, but a physical force. A birth in early spring, when temperatures are beginning to rise and food is beginning to return to the canopy, gives a juvenile the best chance of building strength before the next winter arrives. A birth too early in the middle of deep cold requires the mother to do more to hold the infant against her body longer, to eat more, to move less, to spend reserves she may not have accumulated. He did not know exactly when she had conceived. He did not know when the birth would come. He only knew that she was carrying and that the snow was coming. Through October and into November, he maintained his routine. He arrived at the same entry point into the forest at the same hour. He moved along the same transect lines. He sat at the same observation point on the western ridge for 40 minutes before approaching the troop's general range. He did not change anything. And sometime in late October, he could not pinpoint the exact day she stopped moving away. She still maintained her distance. She still sat at the edge. But when he arrived and settled at his usual observation point, she did not shift her position. She simply continued whatever she had been doing. He wrote nothing about it in the official notes. He wrote in his personal notebook she stayed. In November, she moved more slowly. The weight she carried was visible now, even from 15 meters, and she had begun to select paths through the forest that required less scrambling, wider gaps between rocks, longer routes around fallen logs rather than over them. The other females in the troop occasionally groomed each other. In the afternoon hours, a quiet social act that serves as both hygiene and connection. She did not participate in these sessions. She watched from her usual distance, sometimes reaching forward to groom her own forearm in a slow, methodical way, as if performing the same act alone. The ranger watched her watch the others. He did not write about it. Some things resist the field notebook format. December arrived and the snow deepened. The troop moved toward the eastern side of the peninsula, where two small thermal springs created a zone of relative warmth, where the ground stayed soft at the edges and the air above the water held a few degrees more heat than the surrounding forest. Japanese macaques are one of the few primates documented to use thermal water for thermoregulation. Not instinctively, but as a learned behavior passed through generations within specific troops. This troop had used these springs for as long as the station had records. She used the warmth too, but from the edge. She sat close enough to benefit from the radiated heat of the water, but far enough that no other individual could move toward her without her noticing first. January brought the coldest stretch of the season. The ranger adjusted his observation schedule to account for the shorter daylight hours and the slower movement of the troop in deep cold. He began carrying an extra wool layer in his pack, one he never wore, but that his supervisor had recommended he bring after 2 seasons of watching young researchers underestimate Shimokita winters. He sharpened his pencil every morning. He walked the same lines. She was still there each time he arrived. Still at the edge, still carrying. The last week of January, the ranger noticed she had become almost entirely still during the coldest hours of the morning. She sat hunched on her granite shelf with her knees drawn toward her chest and her arms wrapped across the front of her body, a posture that minimized the surface area exposed to cold and maximized the warmth held against her abdomen. He wrote in his notebook, full term or close. He added watch for separation from troop. On the 29th of January, a storm front moved in from the northwest. The station's weather instruments recorded the lowest pressure reading of the season. By mid-afternoon, visibility in the forest had dropped to 40 meters. By evening, the snow was horizontal. The ranger had already returned to the station. The troop had moved to a dense stand of cedar on the western slope, a windbreak they used every winter when conditions became severe. He had counted 23 individuals before leaving. She had been among them. The storm lasted until the early hours of January 30th. The ranger arrived at the forest before dawn. The snow had stopped, but the temperature had dropped further. His breath came out in dense clouds that disappeared into the white air around him. He found the troop in the cedar stand, exactly where he had left them. He counted once, 22. He counted again, moving his pencil down the column of individuals cross-referencing physical markings. 22. He stood still for a moment and looked at the edge of the group where she always sat. The granite shelf was empty. The snow on top of it was undisturbed. He did not panic. He noted the absence in both notebooks, the official one and the personal one, and he wrote the same thing in both female at rock 7 not present, post-storm possible parturition site separation. Then he went to look. Female Japanese macaques near the end of pregnancy will sometimes withdraw from the main group before birth. This is not universal behavior. Many births occur within the troop's active range in full view of other members, but it happens particularly among younger or more peripheral females, whose position in the social hierarchy does not afford them easy access to the protective core of the group. A female giving birth alone in a Shimokita winter is not immediately cause for alarm. It is, however, cause for attention. The ranger extended his search radius by 200 meters in each direction from the troop's known range. He moved carefully, reading the snow for evidence prints, disturbed bark, compressed areas beneath low-hanging branches where an animal might have sheltered. The new snow from the storm had covered everything deposited before January 30th. Anything that had happened in the 24 hours before the snow fell was invisible now. He found nothing that first day. He returned to the station and ate dinner and looked at his personal notebook for a long time before closing it and going to sleep. His standard monitoring schedule required 3 site visits per week. He began making additional visits on his off days, not as official fieldwork, just as someone who needed to walk a particular set of forest paths until he understood why those paths were not giving him what he was looking for. He varied his routes. He pushed into areas he did not usually visit, sections of the eastern ridge where the terrain became rocky and fractured, where overhanging ledges created natural wind shadows where an animal could find shelter from the kind of storm that had come through on the 29th. The troop continued its normal patterns without her. The ranger watched them closely for signs of distress or disruption, but there were none. The social structure of a macaque troop is resilient to the temporary absence of a peripheral female. She had lived at the edge of the group her whole life. The center continued without noticing the edge was gone. There is something in that observation that the ranger did not write down. By the end of the first week, he had mapped the eastern ridge section in more detail than the station's existing charts showed. He had found 3 rock shelters deep enough to provide meaningful protection from wind. One too small for an animal, her size, one that showed no signs of recent use, and one that contained old macaque scat, dried and frozen, that could have been from any member of the troop at any point in the previous season. Week 2 brought a brief thaw that lasted 48 hours before the cold returned harder than before. During the thaw, the snow surface crusted over with a thin glaze of ice that held weight for a moment before cracking through. Walking was difficult. The crust broke under his boots with a sound that carried through the forest like a slow metronome. He moved as quietly as he could and found nothing he had not already found. Week 3. He began to consider in the evenings at the station the possibility that she had not survived. He did not write this down. He allowed himself to think it, to hold it in the way you hold an unpleasant possibility that exists, whether or not you acknowledge it, and then he folded it away and sharpened his pencil and went to bed. The official field log showed 22 individuals for 22 consecutive monitoring sessions. The personal notebook showed something that looked increasingly like a search diary: distances, covered terrain, features noted, conditions recorded. None of it told him where she was. Week 4. The snow deepened again. February in Shimokita is not the month that weakens. It is the month that tests the commitment of winter itself, whether it will stay or whether it is already thinking of leaving. Most years, it stays. The ranger extended his search south along the cliff face that bordered the eastern edge of the peninsula. He had not searched this section systematically because the terrain was difficult and the existing records suggested the troop rarely used it. But she had rarely done what the troop did. He should have looked here sooner. He wrote that in his personal notebook. The cliff face ran for approximately 400 meters, broken by ledges and overhangs, and in 3 places, deep recesses in the rock where the stone had fractured and separated over geological time. These recesses faced roughly south toward what warmth the winter sun offered, and they were shielded from the northwest winds that characterized the worst of the peninsula's weather. He found scat in the second recess, fresh. He knelt and examined it without touching it, and looked at the stone floor of the recess and found scratch marks in the frost that had accumulated on the rock surface, 5 parallel lines, the width of a macaque's hand. He stood and looked out from the recess at the forest in front of it. The sight lines were clear. From this position, an animal could see the approach of any person or any predator from 40 meters in 3 directions. He marked the location in both notebooks. He did not approach further. He walked back the way he had come. The 33rd day was a Thursday in February. The temperature at the station was -8 degrees Celsius when he left before dawn. He had not slept well. He ate a small breakfast rice, pickled vegetables tea that he finished standing at the kitchen window, watching the sky lighten from black to the particular gray-blue that precedes Shimokita mornings in deep winter. And he put his notebook in his jacket pocket and left. He walked the usual transect to the troop's range first. 22 individuals as expected. He noted it quickly and moved on toward the cliff face without stopping to watch longer. There had been fresh snowfall overnight, light 3 or 4 centimeters, enough to reset the surface, but not enough to obscure what lay beneath entirely. He was 200 meters from the second rock recess when he stopped. In the new snow to his left, crossing the open area between 2 stands of birch, there was a line of prints. Small. The 4-point pattern of a macaque walking at a deliberate pace, not running, not bounding, but moving with intention. 2 sets of prints. A larger set spaced with the weight distribution of an adult female. And beside them, barely indenting the snow at all, a second set of prints no wider than 2 fingers. He stopped. He stood completely still and let the cold settle around him. He did not take another step. The forest was quiet in the way it gets at -8. A quiet that is not the absence of sound, but the suppression of it, as if the cold has reduced everything to its essential frequency. He waited. At the tree line where the birch gave way to the denser stand of cedar at the base of the cliff, something moved. A shape separated itself from the shadow of the trees. She stepped into the open ground between the forest and where he stood. Her coat was thicker than it had been in January, grown out through the weeks of cold into the dense winter pelage that Japanese macaques develop by midwinter. Her face was the same set of the eyes, the same careful assessing stillness that she had always had. Against her chest, curled into the warmth between her body and her forearms, was an infant. Pink-faced, eyes open. The infant's fingers were wrapped around a fold of her fur, and it moved its head slowly to look at the figure standing motionless in the snow. The ranger did not move. He did not reach for his notebook. He did not write anything down. He stood in the snow at -8 degrees in the half-light of a February morning on the Shimokita Peninsula, and he watched the edge of the forest. She turned her face toward him and held her ground. She did not retreat. The infant shifted against her chest, adjusting its grip, and she drew it slightly closer with both forearms without looking away. For 33 days, the forest had held no answer. The snow had held no answer. The rock shelters had held old scat and old marks, and nothing that told him she was alive. And now she was standing 12 meters away in the birch-filtered light of a February morning. And the infant against her chest was real, and breathing, its small hands wound tight in her fur, and the only thing required of the ranger was to remain exactly where he was. Which he did. She stood in the open for another 2 minutes. He timed it later, when he thought about it, estimated it from the quality of light and the way his feet had begun to lose sensation in the cold. 2 minutes is a long time to stand still at -8, and a long time for a wild animal to hold her ground in daylight, 12 meters from a human being. Then she turned and walked back toward the cedars, not hurrying, not fleeing, but simply going the way she had always gone when she had seen enough, and the forest closed behind her. He waited until she was fully gone before he reached for his notebook. His hand was shaking from the cold. He wrote the date. He wrote the temperature. He wrote female at Rock 7, present neonate, confirmed, estimated age 4 to 5 weeks. Then he put the notebook away and walked back to the station. He did not run. He walked at the same pace he always walked, along the same paths he always used, and the forest was the same forest it had always been. But something had shifted in its accounting. A number that had been wrong for 33 days was correct again. She rejoined the troop gradually, not all at once and not without hesitation. In the first days after the ranger saw her at the tree line, she appeared at the periphery of the troop's range in the late mornings, visible but keeping the infant close against her chest and maintaining a buffer between herself and the nearest adult female that was slightly wider than her usual margin. The troop's response was unremarkable in the way that macaque social dynamics often are, which is to say, the dominant females acknowledged her return with a few glances and then returned to whatever they had been doing, and the juveniles moved past her without particular notice, and the adult males displayed no visible reaction at all. The troop had not missed her. She had simply been gone, and now she was present again, carrying something new. This is the ordinary arithmetic of a macaque troop in winter. The ranger recorded her return in the official field log, a female at Rock 7 present, accompanied by neonate estimated age 2 to 3 weeks at time of first postnatal observation. In the personal notebook, he wrote something shorter: she's back. The days that followed had a different quality than the weeks before them. Not warmer February in Shimokita does not soften quickly, but inhabited differently, as if the number 23 restored to the forest had restored something else along with it. March arrived, and the days lengthened by minutes at a time. Increments too small to feel in any single day, but accumulating over weeks into something the forest noticed before the people in it did. The snow on the south-facing slopes began to pull back from the base of the trees, leaving narrow crescents of exposed ground around each trunk. The thermal springs, which had been steaming heavily through the coldest months, quieted slightly as the air temperature rose and the differential between water and atmosphere narrowed. The troop's range expanded. She moved with it still at the periphery, but with a new element to her routine: the infant. The infant was, by early March, approximately 5 to 6 weeks old, at the stage when macaque neonates begin to loosen their grip on the mother's chest and test the world in short exploratory bursts before retreating. It would reach out to touch things: the bark of a passing branch, the snow surface, the air itself, and then pull back against her, apparently reassured by whatever information it had gathered. She tolerated these excursions with patience. She watched the infant reach and return without restraining it. This is how young macaques learn the boundary between what is safe and what is not by being told, but by being permitted to explore within the radius of a body that does not move away. By April, the snow was retreating in earnest. The oaks that had stood bare since October showed the first green at their tips, the particular pale, almost luminescent green of new growth that appears before the leaves have committed to their full form. The troop moved longer distances now, following the emergence of food sources that had been locked under ice for 4 months. She kept pace. The infant, now 10 to 11 weeks old, had begun to ride on her back during travel, rather than clinging to her chest. This is a developmental shift that happens quietly and then seems, in retrospect, to have always been the case. One day the infant is held, and then it is carried differently, and then it is moving alongside. The ranger noticed the change on a Tuesday morning in mid-April. He was at his usual observation point, and she was 20 meters away, moving along the base of a rocky slope, and the infant was on her back, with both hands gripping her fur, looking out at the forest with the expression that young primates have when the world is still more information than interpretation. He wrote in his notebook, infant riding dorsally 10 to 12 weeks. Then he wrote, she is still at the edge. And then, because it was true, and he had not allowed himself to write it before, the distance is smaller now. It was smaller, not dramatically, not in a way that a camera would necessarily capture, but the invisible margin she maintained. The 10 meters that had been inviolable through all of the previous autumn and the entire winter had compressed. She was moving through the troop's range at 8 meters from his usual observation point, sometimes 7. She did not acknowledge him directly. She simply went about the business of foraging and resting and tending the infant, and the space between them had quietly shrunk. The infant was the accelerant. Specifically, it was the infant's complete indifference to the concept of distance. Young macaques at this stage have not yet calibrated their wariness to the specific threats in their environment. The fear of humans, where it exists in a wild troop, is learned, not innate. It is transmitted from mother to offspring through behavior, the retreat, the alarm posture, the particular tension of a body that has decided something is dangerous. But she had never transmitted that particular fear in the presence of this ranger. She had only ever moved away quietly, and then stopped moving away, and then stayed. Her infant had never seen her flee from this person, so it did not know to. By early May, the infant had begun to move independently for short periods, not far, not for long, but with the confident, slightly lurching gait of an animal that is discovering that its legs will hold its weight. It ran toward things that caught its attention. A fallen branch. a piece of ice still clinging to the shadow side of a rock. The ranger. The first time the infant ran toward him, closing the distance in a series of small, bounding steps before stopping abruptly 3 meters away and staring up with enormous dark eyes. The ranger kept his hands in his lap and his weight perfectly still. He held the infant's gaze without returning its curiosity, the way you watch something delicate that does not yet know it is being watched. He watched the infant regard him with the total unself-conscious curiosity of an animal that has not yet learned what it is supposed to be afraid of. After a moment, the infant turned and ran back to its mother. She had been watching. She was still in her position 8 meters away, and she had been watching the entire time. She had not moved toward him. She had not called the infant back. She had simply observed. He wrote nothing in the notebook about what he felt in that moment. Some things you write down, and they become smaller. The infant made this approach 3 more times in the weeks that followed. Each time, the ranger remained still. Each time she watched from her position without intervening. The distance between them, between her and the ranger, continued to close by increments so small they were almost theoretical. But they were real. A measurement taken and written down is a fact that has happened. On a Thursday afternoon in the 3rd week of May, the creek on the eastern side of the troops' range was running hard with snowmelt. The water level was higher than at any point since the previous spring, and the current in the narrow channel where the water ran between 2 rock formations was fast enough to carry small debris, twigs, pine needles, the occasional disintegrating piece of bark downstream without pause. The troop was spread across the slope above the creek, foraging in the newly exposed ground. She was 40 meters upstream from the ranger's position, moving slowly through a patch of low vegetation, the infant ranging around her in its usual radius. The ranger had his notebook open and was recording a behavioral sequence involving one of the juvenile males when he became aware of a sound. It was a vocalization, high-pitched, repeated, carrying the particular acoustic quality of an animal in distress rather than simply in communication. He looked up. She was standing motionless at the edge of the creek bank, looking down. The infant was not on her back. The infant was not visible. He was already moving before he had processed the full picture. He reached the creek bank in 30 seconds and looked down into the narrow rock channel where the water ran fast between 2 stone faces. The infant was there, wedged in a crack in the downstream rock face, approximately 1 meter below the bank level, where it had apparently fallen or slid. The water was running directly past it, close enough that the current pulled at its lower body, and it was gripping the rock with both hands, calling without pause. She was at the bank's edge, directly above it. She reached down, twice her arm extending into the gap, but the angle was wrong, and the infant was too far below. She could not reach it. She looked up. In all the months the ranger had spent inside the boundary of this troop's range, in all the mornings he had sat at his observation point, while she moved at the edge of his sight, she had never once turned her face directly toward him, with intention. She had permitted his presence. She had allowed him to occupy the same forest without retreating from it, but this was not permission. This was a choice. She looked at him the way you look at someone when there is nothing else left to try. He sat down at the edge of the bank and lowered himself into the rock channel, finding footholds on the wet stone, keeping his weight back and his movement slow. The cold of the water hit his legs immediately. He did not hurry. Hurrying in a creek channel with a distressed infant macaque above him and a wild mother watching from the bank would not help anyone. He reached the infant's position and cupped both hands beneath it. Not grabbing, just presenting a surface, a floor where there had been only stone and rushing water. And the infant, after a single moment of stillness, stepped onto his hands. He lifted it. He raised it to the bank level with both hands, held level and steady. She was there immediately. She reached forward, and the infant transferred from his hands to her arms in a single fluid movement, and she pulled it against her chest and turned away from the creek edge. The ranger climbed back onto the bank. His legs were wet to the knee, and his hands were shaking slightly from the cold water. He turned to look. She was still there. She was 4 meters from where he stood, closer than she had ever been, and she was looking at the infant in her arms, turning it in her hands to examine it, running her fingers across its chest and limbs the way a mother checks that something is intact. The infant gripped her fur and went still. After a moment she looked up, not at the forest, not at the creek, at him. It lasted 3 seconds, maybe 4. Then she turned and walked back toward the slope, where the troop was foraging the infant, riding on her back. And she settled into her position at the edge of the group and began to groom the infant's neck with the slow, methodical care she brought to everything she did alone. The ranger stood at the creek bank with wet legs and a notebook he had not opened. He did not follow her. He stood where she had looked at him and let the afternoon settle around him. The creek ran past. The forest was the same forest it had always been. The troop moved on the slope as it always moved. And at the edge of the group, in her habitual position, slightly apart from the others, she sat with the infant in her lap and did not look back. She did not need to. The distance she had always kept, the space that had been for 2 years a kind of answer to a question no one had asked, was still there. She was still at the edge. She was simply no longer alone there. There is a particular kind of trust that cannot be asked for and cannot be given directly. It accumulates the way snow accumulates gradually in layers, each one too thin to matter by itself. Until one morning you look at the forest and realize the ground has been covered for some time. You don't know exactly when it happened. You only know that it has. The infant grew through the rest of May and into June, and the world grew with it. The oaks filled out completely, and the forest that had been a study in gray and white became something else entirely layered and green and alive, in a way that winter makes it easy to forget is possible. The troop ranged widely. She ranged with them, still at the periphery, the infant now moving on its own for longer stretches, returning to her less frequently as the weeks passed. This is the ordinary trajectory of a young macaque's first year. The grip loosens. The world gets larger. The center holds anyway. The ranger continued his monitoring schedule. 3 visits per week, same entry point, same transect lines. He sharpened his pencil every morning. He walked the same paths. And every time he arrived at his observation point, she was somewhere in the troop's range at the edge, as she had always been. The distance between them on a good afternoon in late June was 5 meters. She sat on a rock, not her granite shelf from the winter, but a similar one, flat and sun-warmed, near the base of an oak. And she watched the infant investigate the bark of the tree. And she did not look at the ranger, and the ranger did not look at her. They simply occupied the same afternoon in a forest that was finally warm. He did not write about it in the official field log. Some things resist the format. In the personal notebook, on the last available line of the last available page, he wrote a number. 5. Then he closed the notebook. Then he went to find a new one.